Hello, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Englander, the director of the Massachusetts Aggression Reduction Center, and this is a brief video to give you an idea of how I train faculty. Just a few broad points first before I begin talking about the content of some of the things I talk about. These trainings really should be tailored to what schools are facing and what kinds of issues they're seeing. In addition, it's really important, I think, not to lecture professionals as though they were undergraduates. I tend to focus in faculty training on what's the data, where is it coming from, what does it suggest, and what concrete actions can teachers take. And I think that's a really important point. Let me begin just by pointing out that I show teachers just about a minute or two I spend talking about the studies I conduct so they know where the data that I show them is coming from. Then I often talk about the overuse of the term bullying and how educators can be buried in bullying issues and bullying accusations and bullying data and bullying training, and that this can be pretty overwhelming. Part of this is the myth and the idea that anything that hurts you is bullying. And I often show educators the data that I have from research I did a few years ago, which shows how often kids can overuse the term bullying. Now, why does any of this even matter? Why does it matter that kids overuse the term? It matters because bullying is an issue that is significantly more emotionally destructive than other kinds of social problems. So even though we have all this confusion, I'm explaining why it really matters and why we have to be clearer about what is and what isn't bullying. Now, having said that, there are certain things that confuse this. One of the most important issues is the idea of separating what happens online with kids with what happens in school. And so I always show faculty some data demonstrating to them how much would the online behaviors and the in-school behaviors interact and feed each other. And in fact, online behaviors are one of the biggest determinants of what actually happens in school. Now, online isn't always clearly bullying. That's one of the difficulties. The bullying rubric doesn't always fit into the digital world. And I often explain how that misfit sort of happens. Then I talk about, or I often talk about things like some of the problems. So faculty have often heard online about ineffective solutions, and these are problems or strategies or solutions that are sort of popularized but aren't really effective. So for example, telling kids that what they should do is confront a bully and tell them to stop. That kind of confrontational behavior has actually been studied, and it's now been shown to be counterproductive in most cases. In other words, it'll actually make the bullying worse. So I want to make sure to get rid of some of these ineffective solutions before I begin talking about what faculty actually can do. So the first problem with telling faculty how to respond to bullying is how to recognize it. Because you may have your 3 or 4 criteria for bullying, but you're not necessarily going to actually see or view those criteria when you see kids interacting in person. You may see one child being mean to another child, but you don't have the backstory, and you don't know if it's the first time they've been mean, you don't know if the kids are in a fight, or you don't know if it's part of a campaign against that target. So recognizing that most of the behaviors that we actually see are something called gateway behaviors. And gateway behaviors are actions or words that express contempt for another person. These are primarily the way that kids fight and the way that kids bully in school in front of adults. The difficulty is, again, you don't know the backstory. So even if you recognize a gateway behavior, you really don't know if your response is about bullying or about fighting. And that makes many educators hesitate, because if they don't know it's bullying, then how can they respond to a bullying incident? How do they resolve the issue that if they see kids being mean to one another, but they don't know it's bullying or they don't know if it's fighting, how do they respond to it? The way that I teach them to respond to it is to respond to that inappropriate social behavior itself, not to worry about whether it's bullying or not bullying, but instead just respond to the fact that a child is behaving in a way that's socially cruel. Now, there are other issues that I often go over, and again, this depends on the school and what their needs are. But for example, I might talk about the psychology of different bullies and different victims. That's very, very common. One of the big new fields that I've been studying now for about 2 years are the cognitive and perceptual changes that happen in digital environments, because so much of what happens online feeds the behavior that happens in school. We need to really have a better handle on how to teach kids to use digital technology. So one of the newest areas that is being looked at is teaching kids to understand how perceptions change in digital environments. So I can show teachers a number of different ways that perceptions can change and demonstrate to them cases of how social problems happened because kids didn't understand or adults didn't understand about these perceptual changes. So examples would be, why do you post things that you don't want people to see, even when you know that the internet isn't private? Part of the reason seems to be because of the way your perceptions change when you're using technology. This leads us directly to issues like sexting, which I've done actually a great deal of research on. And when it comes to sexting, I talk about it from a couple of different perspectives. One thing we look at is what messages kids hear from school about sexting, or research on this. This is important because not all kids sext, lots of them don't. And the question is, are these messages the ones that are effective? One of the other issues that I look at is the whole issue of why kids sext and any trauma they may experience afterwards. And this looks at the issue of peer pressure versus what I'll call, for want of a better word, voluntary sexting. And that seems to be a very important distinction. There are other issues that perceptions in digital environments bring up. So the issue of self-cyberbullying, which I really don't have time here to go over, but it is not a particularly rare behavior. It's one that we see in about 15% of teenagers. The whole issue of anonymity and how apps capitalize on this, and what the effects are on what kids do online. But of course, it's not all about online issues. And I always bring it back to how we're going to help kids. And one of these issues is by building resiliency. So I talk about some of the research on what are the factors that really help kids feel more resilient in the face of any kind of social problem. And part of that has to do with family. Part of it has to do with how they view their teachers and their school environment. And sometimes this really helps motivate teachers to try to connect more with their students. Another issue that I sometimes talk about are how early childhood and early childhood education and the changes in how kids are growing up are really resulting in these kinds of social problems. So I talk about technology changes, I talk about changes in. Sometimes too, I talk about the perspective of kids. So I may discuss, for example, what are the problems kids see in school? I often wrap up with a few takeaways, and this has to do with summarizing everything I've talked about. Finally, I always give faculty more resources. So there are resources on our website that are free that they can download and give out to parents and students, and I always wrap up with that. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.